Hi, it's Sue from Pittsburgh Lesbian Correspondence Blog, and this is day two, June 2nd, of both Pridefest and my Pittsburgh Pride Posts effort. I wanted to talk to you today about my earliest memories of Pridefest, and they date back to the early to mid 90s. My best friend John, for whom we named the Dr. John P. Ruffing VMD Pet Food Pantry after, John was an out gay man, and I would tag along with him. I didn't have any understanding that I was queer at that point, which is another story altogether. So my memories are a little blurry. I'm not sure the exact years, and there's not really good documentation that's accessible about what was happening. The prides of the 90s were often in parks, most typically Shenley and Mellon. And, I think they get a bad reputation. Um, and people don't understand what it was like. So, there was an intimacy, but there was very much a sense of community and people contributing. And there were the marches. They weren't called parades, they were marches. People would come through the city as out members of the LGBT community, and at that time, um, and it took a lot of courage. So I think it was 93 and 94, maybe 95. One year it was just pouring. It was just pouring. But we stuck it out, John and I, to welcome the drenched parade participants. It's hard to say. I can't remember who was Miss Pittsburgh Pride, but I do remember she looked amazing even in that rain, and I was really struck by her courage. I had, such a simple understanding of queer identity at that time, but I knew that pride was innately tied to courage. The year that it didn't rain, we sat in the grass near the stage. And this is one of my most vivid memories. There was a sort of punk band. I don't know what they would have been called, but they were singing about My Little Pony and spraying silly string into the crowd. That's such a vivid memory. I wish I could find out who that was because it just stayed with me all those years. It was just fun, and it had a ton of sexual innuendo, and it just really was silly. It was great. That memory's been with me for 30 years. The other thing that I remember back then is that speakers could take the stage. You got like a time slot, so performers could do a couple numbers, but then different organizations, especially those that were very activist oriented, could get up and speak. And it was, not politicians. Politicians were allowed to say hello. You know what? I don't think there were. I don't think any elected officials came to Pride. Well, that's not true. Then Councilman Bill Peduto, who went on to be mayor, and State Representative Dan Frankel came at some point, but I'm not sure when. But in this case, it was like everyday people getting up. They would read poetry. They would talk about, politics. Sometimes they would yell about it. And I just think that that's really missing now, that hearing people's voices. Now we listen to people. We listen to music artists. We watch shows, and that's important, but there's not really as many spaces for people, everyday people, to say something. When people diss the prides of the 90s as if they were somehow lesser, I just shake my head. It was this time of magnificence. People were courageous. Sodomy was still illegal. Most of our lives were illegal. Gathering in a park to like engage and build collective resistance, it was necessary to pivot toward, the street prides. And I'm drawing a blank here. Okay. Yeah, because we couldn't be downtown. We couldn't be now on the north side if we weren't in those parks. Because prior to that, Pride was very different. It was even smaller. And, the 1990s Prides were funded largely by individual and small business donations. There were no corporate sponsors. There were no grants. There were fundraisers year round. And, it was all volunteer. The softball league handled the grilling. The leather community took care of security. Someone else would distribute cold drinks. I remember I did that one year with the GLCC, and oh my God, I thought my arms were going to fall off from putting them into cold ice water to pull up. I don't even know what it was, but somebody like the health organizations like PERSAD and Pittsburgh AIDS Task Force and groups like that, they would have sunscreen to give out and first aid kits. But this is what's interesting. I also remember that some friends told me this. Volunteers, one of my friends who was a volunteer, they would sleep on the stage overnight. So if it would arrive on Friday night, they would spend Friday night sleeping on the stage out in the park to protect it and keep it from being vandalized so that it could be returned and they would get their deposit back. That's commitment, right? It was very much this like DIY theme, do it yourself, because DIY was pretty much par for course in our community. The other thing people don't always think about is that the 90s gave rise to Pittsburgh Black Pride, which is the longest running regional Pride Fest, longer than Pittsburgh Pride, because Pittsburgh Pride has changed so many times. It's just, I think they were founded in 1995, and they've produced Pride events every year since. That's something to be proud of. I wasn't out at the time, I was an ally, but, I felt the energy and security of the space. Anyone who thinks that the community was hiding furtively in a park is gravely mistaken. And I think the fact that now Pride in 2026 ends in a park, just a different park on the north side, is a real testament to those early days. So, I'd encourage you to do some digging, read about Pride's history, and remember that it was never lesser. It was a building block. As our community evolved, Pride Fest evolved. In one direction, it became very corporate. And we saw this year how that created challenges. So I I look very fondly back at those years, in part because I was with my best friend, but also just, how much exposure I got to really the inner workings of the community. So I'm very grateful. Thanks for sticking it out for this long video. The history of things like Pride requires a lot of words. I'm Sue Kerr with Pittsburgh Lesbian Correspondence, and I'm doing this Pittsburgh Pride Post feature to reconnect with people who have read the blog or follow my work or invited me to co-work with them. I really need your support with my legal and living expenses fund. I'm hoping that if you enjoy this content or appreciate it, that you will consider a donation. All the links are in the video. And I'll talk to you tomorrow.